The next item of business is a debate on motion number 9462 in the name of Gavin Brown on Scotland's finances. Members who wish to take part in the debate should press the request to speak button now. And I think it would be helpful if I tell members at this stage we're extremely tight for time, so we will expect you to keep to your time limits, and we're not going to be able to allow any time for interventions. I call on Gavin Brown to speak to and move the motion. Mr Brown, you've got 14 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've had a number of debates on independence in this chamber in recent months, and I'm quite sure we'll have many more in the coming months. But today we want to have a focused debate. We want to have an analytical examination of the public finances were Scotland to become independent. That is the thrust of this debate. And we want this for two reasons. Firstly, because we think there has been insufficient attention focused upon it so far. And secondly, because more and more analysts are challenging the assumptions made by the Scottish Government in its White Paper and in a number of other papers it has produced. The official Scottish Government line today is that Scotland's national accounts are healthier than the UK's. So we intend to examine the truth of that statement. And the Scottish Government, rather than trying to update their papers or update their official projections, say this in their amendment today: we welcome the detailed proposals for Scotland's public finances in the White Paper. A single page in the entire White Paper is described by this Government as detailed proposals. Presiding Officer, we have primary concerns on several areas. Firstly, that the White Paper only features figures for a single year, 2016-17. Nothing for the year after that, nothing for the year after that, nothing for any subsequent year were we to be independent. Sure, happy to give way.
I wonder if the member can give us figures for the UK for the years that he's talking about.
Brown.
I think the member will find that if he read the OBR's analysis last week, they gave very clear projections up to the year 2019-20. I think the member will find, if he read the paper by the Institute for Fiscal Studies in November, they put forward 50-year projections for how an independent Scotland would function. And I think if the member finds, if he even looks at the simplest piece of legislation in this Parliament, such as the Court Reform Scotland Act that my committee was looking at this morning, there were 10-year figures for the cost and implications of that single piece of legislation. So if they can do it for every single piece of legislation, if the OBR do it up to 1920, and if the IFS do it for 50 years, I think even the Scottish Government ought to be capable of producing more than single year's figures. That's concern number one. Concern number two is that the figures that they do put for 2016-17 are now obviously highly questionable. And we challenge the Scottish Government to defend those figures in this chamber today and to make a pledge that they will update those figures to reflect the most recent analysis published by the UK Government, from GERS and indeed from the OBR. And our third concern, Presiding Officer, is that there are no costings for many of their policy commitments contained within the White Paper, and there is not a single penny attributed to the transition costs of moving from being part of the United Kingdom to being an independent Scotland. It is inconceivable that there are no transition costs from unpicking over 300 years' worth of history and becoming a separate state. Nobody in this chamber can believe there would be no financial costs at all attributed to that. Happy to give way.
I'm grateful for the member giving way, and I completely accept that he has every right to look into the detail and all the rest of it, but would you accept the bigger picture that a country of 5 million people with oil and gas is perfectly financially viable?
Gavin Brown.
Presiding Officer, there is a big difference between saying that a country is financially viable and claiming that it would automatically be richer than the country of which it is already a part. That is the charge put forward by the Scottish Government and indeed the Yes campaign, that we would be richer. Every single man, woman and child in this country would be richer as a consequence of independence, according to the White Paper. Now, if the Scottish Government's position now is not that, if its position now is simply that we would be viable, then I suspect most people would agree to that. But that is not what the government is saying. That is not how this government is campaigning. It is saying categorically that we would be richer, despite evidence and suggestions to the contrary. Not just now, so let me make way first of all. Now, we hear that we only have figures for a single year, but it's clear that independence involves far harder choices than the Scottish Government care to admit. So there are serious long-run fiscal pressures that we would have to face. The Institute for Fiscal Studies said this: the main conclusion of our analysis is that a significant further fiscal tightening would be required in Scotland, on top of that already announced by the UK Government, in order to put Scotland's long-term public finances onto a sustainable footing. This means there would have to be significant tax rises and/or spending cuts. That's on top of the UK restrictions already put forward. Now, the Scottish Government say they're going to ignore what the UK want to do because they're going to do things differently. But even if they followed the UK path, there would have to be additional tightening required in Scotland, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. They put this more specifically, that it would have to be... I'll give way to Mr Stewart. He's nothing if not persistent, Presiding Officer.
I thank the member for giving way. What Mr Brown has failed to talk about is economic growth, and we are being constrained by current UK policies, and we could actually grow the economy much more than is currently being done.
Gavin Brown.
Presiding Officer, I don't know where Mr Stewart was when the autumn statement came out. I don't know where Mr Stewart was when the budget came out. I don't know where Mr Stewart has been, full stop, over the last 9 months, Presiding Officer, because the projected growth for the United Kingdom has gone upwards to 2.7% for this year. It will go to 2.6%, 2.5%, and carry on a trend, according to the Chancellor, with projections of that magnitude. What level of growth does Mr Stewart seriously expect Scotland to have in the years following that, when most of the policies, apart from their corporation tax policy, were they to implement it, when almost all of their policies would be identical from a fiscal point of view? Where on earth is he going to get that particular growth from? Perhaps the Cabinet Secretary has the answer to that question.
Cabinet Secretary.
I'll give the answer to that point in my own speech later on, if Mr Brown will forgive me. But what I'll ask Mr Brown is whether the OBR's estimates of economic growth since 2010 have been realised by the Conservative Government.
Gavin Brown.
Mr Swinney knows the answer to that question, Presiding Officer. The projections made in 2010 were long before the euro crisis. A crisis that engulfed an entire continent with whom we do the bulk of our trade, and you saw 6 quarters of uninterrupted contraction. The suggestion that somehow, if we had been independent in 2010, we would not have suffered as a consequence of the crisis when the euro is utterly ridiculous, Presiding Officer. Every economy on the planet was affected by that, particularly every country within Europe. Then let's move on to the figures for 2016-17, where the Government has actually agreed to put pen to paper. Those figures are highly questionable. The Scottish Government say that our net fiscal balance deficit for 16-17 will be 3.2% at the very worst. They say it could be a 1.6% deficit, but at the very worst, it will be a 3.2% deficit. The CPPR this week suggested it would be 5.5%. The Institute for Fiscal Studies suggested it would be 5.2%. The Treasury, admittedly not as independent as the other two, said it would be 5.3%, and Citigroup said it would be 5.4%. So the spread amongst analysts in the Treasury ranges between 5.2% and 5.5% as a deficit in 2016-17, but the Scottish Government alone says it will only be 3.2 at the very worst, potentially, not yet, potentially only 1.6%. The Scottish Government is out of kilter with the analysts. The primary reason for that, not the only reason, but the primary reason, is that they claim offshore receipts in 2016-17 for Scotland will be £6.8 billion at the very worst, £7.9 billion at the very best. The OBR, in their updated analysis, have said it would be £3.2 billion for the UK as a whole, most of which clearly would be Scottish, but but not all of it. This means we have a £4 billion black hole between what the OBR are saying and what the Scottish Government claims is the case. Now, every time you mention the OBR in this chamber, SNP backbenchers have been instructed to chuckle, to ridicule, to make sneering remarks. They didn't used to. They didn't used to, presiding officer, as if to prove my point. They didn't. They fell right into that one. They didn't used to, when the projections were what they wanted them to say. But the First Minister said last week, the figures we have outlined are robust. That's his here. Right. Well, let's check how robust they actually are. Because for 2012-13, we actually have outturned figures as opposed to projected figures. The OBR said that for the UK, there would be £6.5 billion collected. The actual outturned figure for the UK was £6.6 billion. Fairly close. The Scottish Government, though, at the same time, said that the Scottish share of oil revenues for 12-13 would be £6.9 billion. The actual Scottish share was £5.6 billion. So the Scottish Government were out, not just now, the Scottish Government were out by £1.3 billion, yet the First Minister says the figures we have are robust. And what makes that mistake even worse is that the Scottish Government made this prediction in March 2013. There was only a month to go till the year end of the oil revenues actually coming in, but they still managed to misjudge it by well over £1 billion. Well, maybe this was an isolated year. Let's look at 2013-14. The OBR have said their projection for 13-14 is £4.7 billion. The industry, Oil and Gas UK, have said around £5 billion. So there's a spread between 4.7 and £5 billion. The Scottish Government's official position today still is that we will collect £7.1 billion in oil revenues if we're unlucky, but it will be £8.3 billion potentially. I'll give way to Mr Mackenzie.
Members in his last minute. Members in his last minute.
I'll give way to him in my closing speech if he cares to trouble me. So they're out. They're out by at least £2 billion for the financial year we're about to finish. They were out by at least £1 billion last year, but they claim the figures we have outlined are robust. That is why we are calling upon them to publish updated oil and gas figures. They said to the Financial Times this week, we have never committed to regular updates of the forecast. But the bulletin itself says, and this is a direct quote, this is a first in a series of bulletins summarising recent trends in the Scottish oil and gas industry. Further updates will be published in due course. In the ordinary meaning of words, presiding officer, they did say they would update. That's why we're calling on them to update to the fiscal position as a whole for 16-17 and to publish for the years after that. I move the motion in my name.
Thank you, Mr Brown. I now call on John Swinney to speak to move amendment number 9462.2. Cabinet Secretary, you've got 10 minutes.
Presiding Officer, the debate today takes place against the backdrop of last week's budget, which confirmed that our fiscal DEL budget will be cut by almost 11% in real terms over the current spending review period. It's also clear that there are billions more in spending cuts to come. We now know that the Chancellor intends cutting public services until at least 2018-19. Indeed, 60% of the cuts planned by the Chancellor have yet to be implemented. And despite the positive gloss painted by the Chancellor in his budget statement and reinforced by Mr Brown in what he said today, the fact remains that growth has undershot the OBR's forecast in each of the last 3 years. By the end of 2015, UK economic growth will have been 5% less than was anticipated, and public sector borrowing £190 billion higher than projected in June 2010 when the Chancellor first set out his austerity plans. And the point for Mr Brown about the economic performance and why the comparative position of the UK is so poor compared with other countries is that in the G7 countries, Germany, France, the United States, Canada and Japan have all recovered to their pre-recession levels of economic activity, and only the United Kingdom and Italy have failed to reach that pre-recession level of activity. So that's why it matters that the growth of the United Kingdom economy has been poor, and why the explanation given by Mr Brown about the impact of the Eurozone crisis is so completely destroyed by the analysis of the G7 countries and their economic recovery. Now, of course, yes.
Mr Brown.
Are all of those countries projected to have higher growth than the UK in 2014?
Cabinet Secretary.
My point is that Mr Brown's my point is that Mr Brown's excuse of a response to my intervention said that it was to do with the Eurozone crisis, and the data I've just given destroys the analysis that Mr Brown has just put forward. Now, the budget contained an additional £63 million of Barnett consequentials for Scotland over the next 2 years. I intend to update Parliament on how we will deploy these resources in a statement next Tuesday. However, it is important that these consequentials are seen in the context of the vast cuts already imposed on Scotland. This debate also follows on from the publication of the latest Government Expenditures and Revenue in Scotland report, which shows that tax revenues in 2012-13 were £800 higher per head in Scotland compared with the UK. That means that in every one of the last 33 years, tax receipts have been higher in Scotland than the UK. Over the past 5 years, Scotland's public finances have been healthier than the UK's by a total of £8.3 billion. That's the equivalent of nearly £1,600 per person. And our higher tax receipts mean that Scotland's spending on social protection benefits, including pensions, is more affordable, accounting for a smaller share of tax revenues and GDP in Scotland than in the United Kingdom. With an accelerating economic recovery reflecting the underlying strength of the Scottish economy and a clear track record of sound financial management, it is no wonder that an independent Scotland would rank as one of the wealthiest countries in the world. I certainly will.
Under Fraser.
I'm grateful to Mr Swinney for giving way. Can you tell us why the SNP website today tells us this? Scotland gets 9.3% of UK spending, but generates 9.9% of UK taxes. That's clearly incorrect.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, the point at which... At the point at which that statement was put on the website, the data would be based on the GERS figures at that time. Now, obviously that's a statement of fact as the information was available. Now, one point that Mr Brown challenged one of my colleagues, I think it was Mr Stewart, I think, it was about the wealth of Scotland. If we look at the rankings of countries in GDP per capita, in the OECD countries, the United Kingdom would be ranked at number 18, $35,671. Scotland, with our onshore economy and a geographical share of oil, would be ranked as number 14, $39,642 per capita. Of course, I'll give way to Mr Brown.
The Cabinet Secretary says we would be ranked 14th, but in the White Paper he said we would be ranked 8th. What has changed?
Cabinet Secretary.
I'll tell him what's changed. I'll tell him what's changed. The methodology of the OECD has changed. That's what's changed. And in fact, Standard & Poor's have confirmed this, even including North Sea output and calculating per capita GDP, only by looking at onshore income, Scotland would qualify for our highest economic assessment. So if Mr Brown wants to come here and trade advisers and analysts, there is my contribution to his analysis there. When looking at the difference between tax receipts and spending on everyday services for 2012-13, GERS shows Scotland and the UK were both in current budget deficit by almost identical amounts as a percentage of GDP. Scotland's net fiscal deficit, which includes investment spending, was 1% higher than the UK's. Our higher investment spending reflects, in part, the much-needed support that the Scottish Government provided to economic recovery. We made a deliberate decision to switch spending from current to capital budgets, increasing investment to boost the recovery and offset, as far as possible, the full impact of the UK Government's capital budget cuts. This investment has helped the recovery and will continue to pay off in the future. It also reflects the decision, which I know is disputed in the Chamber, to keep water services in the public sector. Is it any wonder that the architect of keeping Scotland's water industry in public hands, the politician who took the risk to hold a referendum to stop the privatisation plans of the last Tory government, Sir Charles Grey, has come to the conclusion that a yes vote is essential in the referendum this September, and some people should perhaps reflect on the conclusions he's arrived at. GERS also shows that Scottish North Sea oil revenues fell between 2011-12 and 12-13. This was largely due to one-off factors such as the unplanned disruption to production at several large gas fields, such as the Elgin field shutdown in March 2012. More importantly, it also reflects record levels of investment spending in the North Sea, where capital investment has reached £14.4 billion last year, more than double the level recorded in 2010. This spending is immediately deductible from companies' corporation tax liabilities. If Mr Johnson will forgive me, I've still got some ground to cover. While this reduces tax receipts in the short term, it increases production potential and in turn future tax receipts. That is, after all, why companies are investing in the North Sea oil and gas sector. And of course, when we look at the opportunities in the North Sea sector, we only need to look at the analysis undertaken by the Wood report, accepted in full by both the United Kingdom and Scottish governments. And I quote from the final report: "Production hit a low of 1.4 billion barrels of oil equivalent last year, but a number of larger new fields are about to come on stream in the next 2 to 3 years, and that could take production back to the levels of 2 to 3 years ago, where it could be sustained for the remainder of this decade." So I think when we look at the analysis and the projection of oil and gas revenues, we have to bear these points in mind. Equally, we have to bear in mind the fact that the CPPR analysis that Mr Brown has cited is no different to the OBR analysis, and it's no different from the IFS analysis, because it is all the same analysis by the OBR. It does not take into account the increases in production, where it assumes that oil production will remain identical over the next 5 years, and it also uses a price assumption which is $21 a barrel below the estimate of oil prices set forward by the United Kingdom Government. Now, the Scottish Government set out in March of last year that we would publish the first in a series of oil and gas bulletins, and we said that we would update them on a regular basis. The Government intends to publish its third oil and gas analytical bulletin in the coming weeks, which will set out the impact that recent developments in the North Sea have on the outlook for future production and revenues as a consequence. Now, in November, we published Scotland's Future, setting out the opportunities created by independence and utilising the latest available data on the opening balance sheet of an independent Scotland in 2016-17. Now that more data is available, we will extend those projections over a number of years, building on the analysis in the White Paper and its central conclusions that Scotland is a wealthy country that will start life as an independent nation with great economic prospects. I will do, yes. Very briefly, Mr. Rennie.
Just in that first year balance sheet that he's already published in the White Paper, why is there no account taken in from the promises from his government to increase welfare spending by £4.5 billion? He's planning to spend exactly the same as Ian Duncan-Smith.
Cabinet Secretary,
what the analysis in 2016-17 does is it sets out the opening balance sheet of an independent Scotland. And of course, what I'm going on to say is that the opportunities that independence offers up are the opportunities to strengthen and to build dynamism into the Scottish economy as a consequence of acquiring the powers of independence. And we have set out in great detail in the White Paper the issues that will be confronted. So, Presiding Officer, the Government will set out further projections, and I'm sure that first in the queue to welcome further projections will be Mr Brown, who's called for them today. There are real choices in the referendum, Presiding Officer. The country can decide whether we want to resign ourselves to an agenda of austerity from the UK Government, or whether we want to do what everyone else in the world does, and that is to take control of our own destiny, to ensure that we have the opportunity to create prosperity, fairness and sustainability for our people and our country, and that is what the Scottish Government will offer. And I move the amendment, Ma'am.
I now call on Jenny Mara. Ms Mara, you've got 6 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It was just this morning that the CBI added its voice to the concerns of the IFS, the CPPR and countless others who have questioned the veracity of the Scottish Government's fiscal plan for independence. No, thank you. In a statement from the UK's top business representative body that could not have been clearer, John Cridland, Director-General of the CBI, said the economic plan outlined in the White Paper does not add up. And he's right, Presiding Officer. Largely thanks to the Scottish Government's continued refusal to accept the word of experts, but instead believe their own hyperbole and their own rhetoric. Take, for example, oil receipts, the primary driver behind the Scottish Government's fiscal plan. The price of oil has more to do with the politics of the Middle East than the needs of Scotland's children for a decent education, the health of our citizens or safety on our streets. And come the referendum, and every day after that, the price of oil will be set, as it always has been, far from these shores and further still from the problems that are in our communities. So it is with frustration, no thank you, it is with frustration that I come to this debate today, to hear abstract figures traded around this chamber, figures based on assumptions, estimates, sheer guesswork, but used as gospel to prove the case for constitutional change. Constitutional change that will last beyond the White Paper's fiscal cliff of 2017, and constitutional change that will last for generations to come. Suppose we do take the Scottish Government's figures as fact, and I don't, that as much as £11.1 billion will be raised annually in revenue and tax from oil by 2017. We still can't escape the fundamental shift that comes with independence from an economy so large and so varied. It pooled resources from all across the UK to support the Scottish banks, to an economy that will leave our public services, to the sum of our entire NHS budget, reliant on the trading price of Brent crude. No. And without a formal currency union, an economy that will leave the money we use to pay for our schools, hospitals, teachers and police service in the control of the bank of a foreign country. Presiding Officer, that is no vision of independence. That is no footing to create a transformed and transformational economy. And it is no way to achieve the sustained generational campaign we need to unpick the social problems that face Scotland. No. For as sure as poverty, inequality and poor health have been passed from generation to generation, they will surely take generations again to shift. Recent history does not favour the Scottish Government's optimism. The OBR revision of North Sea oil revenues and taxes from £6.7 billion to £4.1 billion by 2017 is cause for alarm. But
Members clear she's not taking any interventions.
But moreover, what concerns me is that we have a government not prepared to acknowledge the dubiety of its fiscal position that is so strikingly apparent in the £7 billion difference in projected oil revenue between the OBR and its own estimates. And say the government is wrong, say the OBR is right, say the CBI is right, say the CPPR is right, say the IFS is right. Well, what then?
Mr Stewart, stop it.
A fiscal position that will leave us worse off than the rest of the UK and not better. And with the Scottish Government's planned cut in corporation tax, we know it will be the nurses, it will be the police officers, it will be the teachers of our children that suffer as John Swinney is forced to make public service cuts deeper than Osborne or raise taxes on workers everywhere. Presiding Officer, I didn't come into politics to make that choice, and I don't think John Swinney did either.
Thank you, Ms Mara. We now move to the open debate. I call Christian Allard, followed by Malcolm Chisholm.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I hope that I'll take all my time and not only 4.5 minutes. Let me first thank the Scottish Conservative Party for giving me the opportunity to promote the North East of Scotland, the powerhouse of the UK, soon to become the powerhouse of an independent Scotland. The question that most people are struggling with is, what would you say to living in one of the world's wealthiest nations? Let's take a look at how wealthy we really are. The North East contributes to Scotland's booming food and drinks industry, which is worth £13 billion a year. Scottish beef, Scottish fish and whisky are some of our great successes. From Royal Deeside to the Banffshire and Buchan coast, with Angus and Mearns as the great cities of Dundee and Aberdeen, we have a huge market for tourism in the North East. A market for wealthy tourists from wealthy countries like ours, countries like Norway and Germany, and even a few more from France, with French media and French journalists reporting events in Scotland like never before. Our rural economies are generating billions of pounds per year. Our universities are world leaders, with some of the best being in the North East. Of course.
Neil Findlay.
I just want to congratulate the member on making the case for the union.
The member maybe didn't hear right. Maybe the accent could cause him some problem. I was talking about the North East of Scotland, of course. At least the people of Scotland are being told the truth. The truth that we are living in one of the world's wealthiest nations. Recently, we heard a change of tone from Scottish Labour and the Devolution Commission. The Labour Devolution Commission, another commission out of many, stated that we are the third richest part of the UK, after London and the south east of England. And this without the North Sea oil revenue, Presiding Officer. The same oil revenue that Tories are concerned about today. Let's talk about the CBI report that Jenny Mara brought to this debate. The CBI report this morning is backing the Labour Commission statement. On page 3 of the CBI report, I quote, "The Scottish economy is emerging strongly from the shadow of the global economic crisis. Its growth rate has been almost exactly the same as the equivalent figure for the UK over the past 40 years. Moreover, upon independence, Scotland will be one of the wealthiest nations within the OECD, coming 8th out of all OECD nations in 2011. The same figure that Mr. Brown found out in the White Paper. Astonishing, some would say. I wonder, Presiding Officer, if Gavin Brown and Jenny Mara would trust the CBI and Scottish Labour Commission's finding. We instead would choose to share Westminster's concerns on our ability to prosper with all this wealth. It is clear that the Tory government in London will lose control of all this wealth after a yes vote. I believe, Presiding Officer, that there lies the Tory concerns. We have been here before. Underestimating the value of North Sea oil is becoming a habit for successive Westminster governments. My point, Presiding Officer, is that the fiscal challenges we are facing today are not due to optimistic projections from the Scottish Government, projections that are lower than the industry's own projections. But the fiscal challenges we are facing today are due to the negative contributions that successive Westminster governments have made to the North Sea industry. Today is another of those contributions from no campaigners warning us of the challenges that bring such wealth and talking down the oil and gas industry. What would you say to living in the world's wealthiest nation? Presiding Officer, someone in the North East knows how it feels to live in one of the world's wealthier nations. Coming from a fishing background, Sir Ian Wood saw the opportunities that North Sea oil revenue can bring. And how optimistic is Sir Ian Wood about the future? The answer is clear and can be found in the work Sir Ian Wood has put into his final report, the United Kingdom Continental Shelf Maximising Recovery Review. This report is not only telling us about one of the greatest industrial success stories in modern times, but it also points out that governments need to step up the game to attract more investment in the oil and gas sector. How did Westminster respond to this optimism, this vision for the industry? Presiding officer, with its latest budget, the UK government caused fiscal uncertainty across the North East oil and gas sector. George Osborne's budget promise was to take forward all recommendations of the Wood Report published on the 24th of February this year. Instead, a month later, the Chancellor's response to the Wood Report was to surprise the industry with another tax out of the blue, a tax on rigs and flotels in the North Sea. With 27 billion barrels of resources yet to recover, North Sea industry chiefs are absolutely astonished by another example of fiscal instability that is being delivered by the UK coalition government. Presiding Officer, just in case Gavin Brown thinks I am exaggerating the resources still to cover, please. 27 billion barrels of oil is a projection of BP. While on page 57 of the Scottish Government's white paper, the Scottish Government has a modest projection of 24 billion of remaining reserve. The right policy mix and fiscal stability can be delivered under independence. A Scottish Government in an independent Scotland will make the most of North Sea oil and gas and underpin our prosperity for years to come. Presiding Officer, now that we agree that we are living in one of the world's wealthiest nations, the only question remaining is what should we trust with our future successive Westminster governments who do not understand Scotland and its wealth, or our own Scottish Government, ourselves.
Thank you. Now Colin Malcolm Chisholm to be followed by Kevin Stewart.
Presiding Officer,
6 minutes, please.
The government's amendment today, like much of the Cabinet Secretary's speech, is dogmatic and partial. It ignores vast quantities of expert evidence and analysis, and it denies the intrinsic uncertainty of so much of the future that we are considering. For example, in terms of its being partial, it talks about revenues, but does not talk about spending. For example, also it talks about the fiscal position of the last 5 years, but not the previous decades. I suppose we should be grateful because it's an improvement on the Scottish Government website. As Murdo Fraser pointed out, it fastens on 1 year where the percentage, where Scottish revenues as a percentage of UK revenues exceeded Scottish public expenditure as a percentage of UK public expenditure. So that is a criterion that the Scottish Government accepts on its website. They found 1 year, and they ignored the fact that in each of 16 of the previous 18 years, Scottish public expenditure as a percentage of UK public expenditure was greater than Scottish revenues as a percentage of UK revenues. And that takes us right to the heart of the problem that we're debating today. Now, we can argue about oil prices all afternoon and all evening too in a moment. But the important point here, as the Institute of Fiscal Studies has emphasised, is the uncertainty and volatility, contrary to Scottish Government certainty about increasing oil revenues.
Mike Mackenzie.
Is the proposition that you're trying to make the argument that Scotland is too poor to be independent?
Malcolm Chisholm.
Ridiculous statement. You're obviously not listening to what I'm saying. Of course, an independent Scotland is financially viable, but we would not be better off. That's the crucial point that I and many others are making this afternoon. Now, the Cabinet Secretary said that the Centre for Public Policy for Regions Analysis was dependent on the OBR. It's not dependent on the OBR. It deals with a range of scenarios for oil price in the next few years, and it says it would need currently unforeseen improvements in North Sea production and/or the oil price before Scotland's fiscal balance reverted to being better than the UK's. And what is clear, of course, in the much longer run is that oil revenues will decline, not least because of decommissioning, which will result, of course, in tax reliefs for oil companies in order to decommission. And Rowena Crawford and Gemma Tetlow, in another piece of expert analysis in the National Institute Economic Review for last month, February of this year, said, "Our broad conclusion that Scotland faces a tougher long-run fiscal challenge than the UK as a whole is robust to a variety of alternative, sensible assumptions." So that is the fiscal problem and challenge that Scotland faces, over and above the currency problem that we're not focusing on particularly today, although we do know that would have profound effects on interest rates and many other matters. Now, of course, many people choose to ignore these economic and financial realities and hope that they can be bypassed by aspirations for progressive social change? Well, they can't be bypassed, of course. And over and above that, I don't think the Scottish Government's white paper is exactly a model for progressive social change. And a clear example of that, and this is relevant directly to the fiscal subject of today's debate, is the proposal to cut corporation tax 3p below whatever the prevailing rest of UK rate for corporation tax is. And now, Joseph Stiglitz, I think a member of the Fiscal Commission of the Government, has said that that would not have any effect on investment but would create more inequality. And Crawford Beveridge, I think also on the Fiscal Commission at the Finance Committee 2 or 3 weeks ago, said that that kind of change wouldn't have any significant effect on investment either. So what we would have is a further £385 million cut to the budget of an independent Scotland, in increasing the fiscal challenges it would already face. And that, of course, ignores the fact that under the Scottish Government's preferred model of a monetary union, they wouldn't be allowed to cut corporation tax by 3p anywhere. Indeed, the full range of economic levers that they boast about in their motion would also be completely impossible under the kind of monetary union that they want. And, of course, they're clinging in their desperation to an analysis by Professor Leslie Young this week, although I have to say that his analysis uses the word tight fiscal union, and also the rather alarming picture that he paints. If we did have a monetary union, there would have to be a migration of the banks, and I quote, there would be slow-motion bank run on Scottish banks as people shifted their deposits to English banks. And this is the key person this week that the Scottish Government is invoking in order to persuade people to vote for independence. He may believe he has some points in criticising the particular financial and economic analysis of the Permanent Secretary to the Treasury, but he himself talks about the macroeconomic and financial risks of a monetary union. So, as Peter Jones said at the end of a devastating article in the Scotsman on Tuesday, Professor Leslie Young has demolished the economic case for independence. So, indeed, the Scottish Government is clutching at straws. It's actually doing that with Standard & Poor's as well, but I haven't got time to go into an analysis of Standard & Poor's. The reality is that there will be no monetary union, and that will result in higher interest rates and much wealth. And that, of course, will be on top of the fiscal difficulties that we are subject of today's debate. And I'll end by repeating what I said in the intervention a moment ago. Of course, an independent Scotland is financially viable, but we would certainly not be better off.
Many thanks. Now call on Kevin Stewart, to be followed by Willie Rennie.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. We've heard a lot today about projections and some perceived realities, but let's look at the realities as they are. The UK budget figures show that George Osborne has failed on every test which he set himself. He said that debt would begin to fall as a share of GDP by 2014-15, that the current account should be in balance by 2015-16, and that public sector net borrowing would fall to £20 billion in the same year. The Chancellor reported that debt will not begin to fall as a share of GDP until 2017-18. The current account will not be in the black until 2017-18, and the public sector net borrowing will not be £20 billion in 2015-16. It will be a much higher £68 billion. We have the highest level of public debt in the UK's history at £1.5 trillion. And as the Cabinet Secretary has rightly pointed out, the UK has the weakest performance of any G7 country apart from Italy. We also know the realities are that there are £37 billion worth of cuts still to come over the course of this Parliament. And the Chancellor, of course, has confirmed his austerity drive until at least 2018-19. Jenny Mara talked about people. How does that affect people? Well, for households in the bottom income quintile, cuts are the equivalent of £814, 3.4% of income. These are the realities that we have to bear today. these austerity measures and a failure by a UK Chancellor to boost the economy, to improve the living standards of people, not only here in Scotland, but also in the rest of the UK. Now, I believe that we, if we had the levers of power, could do so much better in terms of boosting that economy. And let me concentrate in a few areas where I think that's possible. And I'm going to touch very briefly on oil and gas. I'm sure everybody expects me to speak about oil and gas to a degree. But what we have in the North Sea Basin, and have had for a very long time, is the instability of Westminster rule. 16 changes to the fiscal regime in the last 17 years and 14 different oil ministers. The income that could have been taken out of that basin is so much more over that piece. It is unbelievable. And don't take my word for it. Take the word of Sir Ian Wood, because that is what he has said. 16 changes to the fiscal regime, 14 oil ministers, and that is why in the past few years, until this past year, we have seen companies actually moving and investing into West African province and other places. I'll take a brief intervention from Mr Gray. After all, it is a debate, although some folk don't realise it.
I certainly accept that the oil industry likes stability. But if stability under the UK has been so bad, why is it that Shell and BP both think that the best chance of stability is for Scotland to remain part of the United Kingdom rather than be independent?
Kevin Stewart.
What we have heard is from some of the elites in the UK, the elites in terms of that. And I think he should talk to folks who are involved in production in BP and Shell and the many other companies that I talk to on a regular basis, because they have a completely and utterly different view and believe that a Scottish Government would create the stability that is required to create long-term investment. I'm going to move on from there, because I think what we actually require is a can-do approach. A can-do approach in terms of boosting the economy. And sometimes we are completely and utterly restricted by the fixation that there is for the economy of London and the south-east of England. What Vince Cable has called London, a kind of giant suction machine draining the life out of the rest of the country. Everything aimed at boosting the economy in London and the south-east, and very little here. However, in saying that, we do very well in some quarters, mainly in spite of the things that are thrown at us. We have great situations in terms of organisations in the country boosting exports. I think the wee county of Angus is a prime example of that in recent years, where they made very early links with China and have benefited since. And I think that's allowed the Scottish Government and others to boost our exports dramatically to that area in recent years. Now, I'm going to have to finish, I know, Presiding Officer. The realities are that the Chancellor has not delivered, as he said he would. That is typical of Westminster Government. It's time that we had the can-do approach here in Scotland, time we had the levers of power to drive economic growth and to share the wealth that this nation quite obviously has. Thank you, President Officer.
Thanks so much. Now Colin Willie-Rennie to be followed by Chick Brodie.
If you were to listen to Kevin Stewart, you would think that Scotland has not benefited from 130,000 extra jobs since 2010. That growth is not up and that unemployment is not down. But the reverse is true. The conditions have improved despite people in other parts of this chamber claiming that none of these plans would work. They said it would make it worse. In fact, it has worked. We're on track. We're making progress. And a little bit of recognition from the SNP benches would give them some credit. Now, I know John Swinney is a modest man, but today is a glorious day for John Swinney. When he prepared his paper for Cabinet eyes only, he told them that an independent Scotland would be highly dependent on volatile and uncertain oil revenues. His report was subsequently downplayed. A spokesman for the government said it was out of date almost as soon as it was published. Within days of the report, the First Minister, with the usual great bravado, claimed there was going to be a new oil boom. He said he was making, in quotes, a cautious estimate before making incautious predictions. A spokesman said Mr Swinney's report had been overtaken by events, with oil revenues having surged. But we knew that John Swinney was right. So we stand here today, I think all my colleagues here on these benches, we stand here today to praise John Swinney. Once disowned by his cabinet, he's now been vindicated for what he said in that paper. And I salute John Swinney as the new oil prophet. I think is somebody that we should perhaps listen to if he adopts the approach that he had in his secret report for the Cabinet. So let's remember what John Swinney said in that report. He referred to volatility. North Sea tax receipts have been more volatile. He talked about uncertainty. He talked about production being lower than previously envisaged and higher operating and exploration costs. He repeated the fact that this high level of volatility creates considerable uncertainty in projecting forward Scotland's fiscal position. And on falling resources, he said, not just now, he said these downward revisions have resulted in a deterioration in the outlook for Scotland's public finances. So let's look what has happened to those oil revenues. In the last GERS figures, the UK oil revenues fell from £11.3 billion in 2011-12 to £6.6 billion in 2012-13, £4.7 billion less. Now, what was interesting was the reaction. And the reaction from Mr Salmond was he blamed the unpredicted shutdown of the Elgin-Franklin field. He said this in part was caused by the unplanned disruption, production and above-average levels of spending and development. He confirmed he was damned by his own words, that he confirmed that there was uncertainty in the North Sea. Exactly the point that John Swinney was making. I think
Mr Rennie's not giving way.
Mr Swinney.
Grateful to Mr Rennie for giving way, but if Mr Rennie follows the logic of his argument and that there is investment made by North Sea oil and gas companies which is offset against revenues, there is a gain to come in future years, which is exactly the point that I made in my address to Parliament a moment ago.
Mr Rennie.
I'll address that point in a second, because of course there is higher operational and capital expenditure going on in the North Sea. But the result is there is a reduction in the revenues forthcoming. And because it is more difficult to exploit this oil going forward, these costs will remain high and the revenues will be lower. The return is lower. I think Mr Stewart perhaps gets the indication by now. No matter how loud he shouts, I am not going to intervene. Let him to intervene. But the second point Mr Salmond said was about the Elgin-Franklin field, which I noticed Mr Swinney did not comment on. It was unpredicted. It was unplanned. That is the uncertainty about the North Sea. We have unpredictable events. Unpredictable events lead to unpredictable finances that have a direct impact on the finances. And he said then, let's look at 5 years. Of course, let's look at 5 years. Because let's look at how they bobbed around over the last few years. 9.3 billion, down to 8.9 billion, down to 7.4 billion, up to 12.5 billion, down to 5.9, 8.4, 11.3, 6. It's bobbing about all the time. The unpredictability of the revenues from the North Sea is considerable. So Mr Swinney was right about the volatility, the uncertainty and the falling resource over time. And I praised him then, and I'm praising him now. I just hope that he sticks to that. But the significance of this for the public finances is considerable, because in the United Kingdom, the oil revenues account for something like 1.5–2% of the total government tax take. But for Scotland, it's a massive 15%, sometimes 20%. So if you've got that volatility on such a narrow economic base, the impact for public services is considerable.
As you draw to a close, please.
In a second, they say on the oil fund that will give the cushioning. There will be no oil fund on day one, even if the oil revenues fall below what we need for public services. So the implications for public services are considerable. So I'm pleased that he's agreed to to Gavin Brown's reasonable request. And I hope he adopts the approach that he adopted in his Cabinet paper, because if we get that, we might get a little bit more transparency.
Thanks very much. Now Colin Brodie to be followed by Neil Findlay. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Today's motion reminds me of Bacon's statement that if a man begins with certainties, he will end with doubts. So let's sow the seeds of further doubts in the minds of the opposition. The acclaimed certainty that the White Paper should have projected figures beyond the single year 2016-2017. It clearly fails to recognise that the only thing that is certain is the change that there will be in constitutional circumstances taking place after September 2014 and the period of change, significant change that it will be between then and March 2016. So it's a bit rich to come here today demanding projected budget figures beyond the financial or investment cycle, which is currently subject to UK government interventions. Let them come. Let them come and negotiate in the interests of both Scotland and the rest of the UK so that we can plan further ahead. The motion implies, I think, a subtle cri de coeur that our government should prepare a longer-term budget, knowing that there will be, and they know there will be, huge changes as a consequence of independence, and any numbers accordingly will be impacted. The determinants of full taxation, not just corporation tax, that will create productivity, growth and increased revenues are not yet in this Parliament's hands, but soon will be. The proposed policy on childcare and immigration are but two examples of planning for that growth. Already underpinned by confidence in the number of jobs created by foreign direct investment in the last 5 years. I have the numbers here. As a percentage, foreign jobs created by foreign direct investment in 2008, 8%. In 2010, 19%. 2011, 20%. 2012, 16%. So our freedom to set taxation and fiscal policies to generate and stimulate small businesses, manufacturing and our exports will, of course, impact the number that the motion seeks. These policies, as I said, are not yet in our grasp. Presiding Officer, the motion goes on to illustrate that a number of independent experts predict a weaker fiscal position than the government predicts. And they mention the CPPR report. Well, let's look at what the CPPR report says and what one of their authors say. This will drag us into oil revenues later in my peroration. But it does more than that. It questions the so-called forecasting ability of the Office for Budget Responsibility, now on its 4th or 5th revision to North Sea revenues and production. What does the CPPR report say? I quote, OBR makes no forward assumptions over what might happen to the Barnett formula or Scottish finances, so it is not possible to be certain over whether the fiscal position under independence would be better, that's better, or worse than that within the existing UK. Or, in their evidence and submission to the EET, Committee's Review of Scotland's Economic Future post-2014, that, and I quote, the scenarios show that by 2017-2018, in cash terms, Scotland's share of revenues could be as high as £11.8 billion or as low as £4.1 billion. Now, that's some fiduciary limit to play with. No, I'm not taking any because we have a limited time. Or Table 1, attached to the CPPR report, in cash terms, and I know that Mr Brown loves to talk about cash terms, it reflects whether it's GDP including oil and gas, GDP excluding oil and gas, GDP per capita excluding oil and gas. In every item, Scotland's growth rates are greater, in some cases much greater than the UK's. Or in my question to Professor Joe Armstrong, one of the contributors and signatories to the CPPR report, at the above committee meetings, I asked the question, Professor Armstrong, what credibility do you give to the projections from the Office for Budget Responsibility and the seemingly unending fluctuations? Professor Armstrong, that is a wide-ranging conversation. I cannot give you chapter and verse on the OBR's forecasting record. You would probably want me to say something about oil price forecasts, since that is the most contentious element of the OBR's performance. Presiding Officer, the two last points, if I may, on the oil issue. BP, which provides global oil consumption data going back to 1965, stated that global consumption of oil stood at 89.8 million barrels of oil per day in 2012. The International Energy Agency's World Energy Outlook 2013 world oil demand, it says that world oil demand will grow to 101 million barrels of oil per day by 2035. And against that backdrop, and even against what the doomsayers say that our oil is running out, with increasing demand, then the forces of supply and demand would suggest a very dramatic rise in oil prices.
And finally,
Presiding Officer, if I may quote on the IFS, which is also drawn into the motion. Again, I questioned Paul Johnson, who heads up the IFS. And his quote was, "I don't disagree with any that Scotland is clearly a rich economy. Within the UK, it is one of the richest regions. No doubt it will continue to be successful." I can't say any more.
many thanks. Now call on Neil Finlay to be followed by John Mason. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. It's most unusual to follow two Liberal Democrats in a row there. Can I say I welcome this debate. The more we scrutinise the SNP's version of independence, the better, because the White Paper itself is full of holes, its uncosted promises and delusional sentiments. But what it does, it offers a glimpse of just the type of independent Scotland that Mr Swinney has in mind for us. It's a deregulated, low-tax, red-tape-cutting economy, not a Scandinavian social democracy, but a neoliberal trickle-down economy, serving the interests of big business, based outside the sphere of influence of the Scottish political system. That's his vision. Now, through Barnett, currently, we have UK-wide redistribution from areas of wealth to areas of need. That is a good thing. I know we will hear calls from, not a moment, calls of, well, what about oil? Well, as we've seen recently, and as people have mentioned, there is an inherent volatility in oil prices. Imagine having to wake up every day and look out the window to check the oil price to see if we can fund our schools, hospitals and public services. And even if the oil price was stable, the revenues would only plug the gap that we've already been told about from all the various commentators, the CPPR, IFS, GERS and all the rest of it. I'll take Mr Allard at this point since he intervened.
Can I invite the member to come to the north east of Scotland and to come and have a look what an independent Scotland will look like, a prosperous country?
Neil Finlay.
I'd be delighted to come to the north east again, but I thought earlier on you were arguing for independence for the north east. That sounded like what you were arguing. Presiding Officer, the White Paper or the SNP manifesto is a remarkable document. It promotes a vision of a country where everything that is bad disappears and everything that's good in life just gets better all the way across on a ballot paper. It's just not credible. I believe in good, well-funded public services. That is the civilising force in our society. But you cannot build such services at the same time as handing out gifts to the corporations. If we were to cut corporate taxes in Scotland to attract foreign companies, then inevitably, absolutely inevitably, England would follow to compete, then Wales will want to cut, and we'll see a spiral to the bottom on taxation, absolutely followed by a spiral to the bottom on wages and terms and conditions too. Even Joseph Stiglitz, who's quoted by the First Minister regularly, has said it's a gift to the corporations and will increase inequality in our society. The head of Waterstone's books said it's a dash to the bottom, and it is insanity, because personally I think schools and hospitals are a rather good idea. Somebody has to pay for them. Now there is the words of a wise man. And what about the spectacularly bad plans for the currency, where it's assumed we'll enter such an arrangement, currency union, even though the government has been told repeatedly it won't happen? The proposal again tells us what type of Scotland will emerge if the SNP have their way. It would mean we would hand control and influence over interest rates, borrowing, regulation and all other areas affecting the currency to what by then? will be a foreign bank, Bank of England, and the RUK Chancellor. No politicians at Westminster to have any influence on our budget, on our benefits and tax rates. So a sterling zone, far from bringing powers to Scotland, hands powers away. And as the Eurozone has taught us, you can't have economic union without political union. I'll give way to the Liberal Democrat.
Chip Brodie.
Clearly, Mr Finlay is so clever his brain has gone to his head. Can you tell me how much influence the MPs in Westminster had over the last budget?
Neil Finlay.
You've got MPs representing you at Westminster. They have influence over policy. They debate policy, they discuss policy, and they vote on policy, Mr Brodie. I'm sure that must have passed you by. So we now have a choice. We can have the positive Labour case for enhanced devolution within the UK. We can keep the pound, avoid a currency union, avoid our budget borrowing, tax and benefit rates being signed off by the Chancellor of another country, and we can avoid the nonsense on stilts of the currency union. We can maintain the Barnett formula, the UK-wide redistribution, where Scotland gets a greater share of public spending, or with independence it can be scrapped. We can build a diverse economy, or we can have one reliant on oil. We can have progressive taxation, with the highest earners taking a greater share of the burden, or we can have John Swinney's vision. And we can have corporate taxes consistent across the UK, or tax competition and a race to the bottom. And we can extend the living wage, end zero-hours exploitation and deal with tax avoidance through procurement. Or we can have Maureen Watt, Gordon MacDonald, Jim Eadie and Adam Ingram vote these progressive moves down like they did last week. In the last 6 months of this campaign, we can now debate two visions of Scotland. An SNP vision based on the fantasy that a tax-cutting, deregulated free market agenda will deliver increased and improved services, or a Labour vision based on core values of solidarity, justice, fairness and equality.
Many thanks. I call on John Mason to be followed by Murdo Fraser.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I'd like to start this afternoon with looking just a little bit at where we are now and where Scotland is now within the UK. And the first point is a failure of Westminster. The UK has not been a success story. We've heard that specifically in regards to oil from Christian Allard. But we certainly have seen it too in regards to income and wealth distribution. The UK has failed on that. Welfare reform, the UK has failed. Poverty, the UK has failed. In maintaining a manufacturing industry, Germany has done much better than the UK. And it is because Germany is so successful that they are able to bail out Greece and other countries. By contrast, the UK can barely bail itself out. Germany has used the EU and the euro for its own advantage. By contrast, the UK has dithered and continues to dither at the door of the EU, not knowing whether to take part fully or run off home. It is the worst of both worlds. Then we look at the future. Now, we are certainly arguing today that the size of the cake in an independent Scotland will be at least as big and probably considerably bigger than our share of the current UK cake. However, there are people who would argue that even if the cake was a bit smaller, that would not matter so much if it was shared out more fairly. We do not actually need an economy of the current size to give the people at the bottom a better life. This party would like to improve things, and we have set out a plan, all 600 and whatever pages of it. Now, this debate is initiated by the Conservatives, and presumably they hope to see if there are some flaws in our plan. Well, fair enough, that is their job. But what are the alternative plans, Presiding Officer? What is the Conservative plan? Maybe some more powers, but we don't know much about that. And we didn't see much movement from the Conservatives when the last Scotland Act was going through the committee which I sat on here, and they would not even give us any more income tax powers, no more powers over the Crown Estate, no powers over air passenger duty. Maybe going forward the Conservative plan will be to cut £4 billion off Scotland's budget. Probably they will continue to cut the welfare budget, crushing those who are already struggling. Definitely we have a budget that is cutting incomes for the bottom 20% by £814 per year. I will give way.
Can the member provide an explanation, because the Finance Secretary didn't, as to why there's not an increase of £4.5 billion in the first year of an independent Scotland for its welfare budget? It seems to be the same budget as Ian Duncan-Smith is planning.
I think the member makes a mistake, which is actually at the key of my argument today, which is, yes, by all means, let's look at 1 year, let's look at 2 years, let's look at 5 years. But let's look at a bit of the longer term, the bigger picture. We're making a big decision here. And 300 years ago, we went into a union partly because we had big financial problems. 300 years later, we are part of a country that has 1.5 trillion of debt. It has not been a success. We have relatively lost a large part of our population compared to the rest of the UK. We have poured lives into wars around the world. This union has not been a success. So there are bigger decisions to make here than just 1 year's finances. The Labour plan. Now, what is the Labour plan? What might we get? Well, of course, we hear a lot about what might happen if Labour win at Westminster in 2015. And even if they did do some good things, and let's give them the benefit of the doubt, that a Labour government in 2015 would do some good things. But 5 years later, that would all be undone again by a Conservative government. And what have Labour promised us so far? Well, maybe some extra powers over taxation, taking us from 22% to 26%. Well, wow, that is exciting. And look at the Labour record. Failed to regulate the banks, virtually bankrupted the UK, failed to close the rich-poor gap. Jenny Mara, who would not take an intervention from me, talked about social problems. Surely she would accept that this Parliament is more committed to sorting social problems than Westminster is. Neil Findlay would not take an intervention, but we had a speech there talking about redistribution, and it was like listening to some kind of, he used the word fantasy himself, presiding officer, and yet it was like listening to a fantasy speech. What might happen in some ideal Labour world as compared to reality in 2014. Presiding officer, this is not just about finance. Of course finance is important, and of course we want some projections for the future. But there is a danger we get so bogged down in the minutiae that we lose the bigger picture. When I left home in my 20s, I wanted to run my own life. I did consider the limited salary I was on at that time and my likely expenses, but they were not the only deciding factors. Income and expenditure were important factors, and as long as they appeared reasonable, and as long as I accepted there was some uncertainty about them, I could go ahead and make my decision to set up my own home. Similarly, people get married, people move in with a partner, not just based on the financial expectations, but on what they want to do with their lives. I believe one of the mistakes the Conservative Party has made over a number of years has been to put too much emphasis on money and profits and too little emphasis on other important things like relationships, society and caring for the vulnerable. When looking at income and expenditure past and present, we can choose 1 year or a set of years that suit us, but let us not lose sight of the bigger, longer-term picture. Many countries around Scotland's size, without Scotland's resources, are doing extremely well. Recently, I spoke at an ACCA IOD breakfast debate, and the point came up as one of the audience said, and I thought it was well put, of course there is uncertainty about the future. The question is, who do we want to manage that uncertainty? And I would suggest, based on past record, that this Parliament would manage the uncertainty better than Westminster would.
Many thanks. Now call on Murdo Fraser to be followed by Ken McIntosh.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I just start by saying how pleased I am to see Gavin Brown back in the chamber. For those of you who don't know, Mr Brown was absent unwell for the last 2 days. I don't want to go into any details, Deputy Presiding Officer, but it's fair to say on Monday, Kermit the Frog was not the only green thing around Parliament. But I'm delighted he's back and restored to health and leading this debate so well. The Scottish Government's annual GERS figures are a useful mine of information for anyone interested in not just the finances of government, but also our constitutional future. Now, for the past year, we've been constantly told by people in the SNP, like Mr Swinney and his colleagues, that Scotland puts more into the UK than we get back out. We've been told we contribute 9.9% of tax revenue while getting back only 9.3% in terms of spending. Now, of course, these figures never correlated because the totals were different. And that, of course, was not always disclosed, and we were left with a £7 billion annual deficit. The latest figures are, of course, less encouraging for the SNP. They show the situation has been reversed. And even on that own flawed measure, we are now putting in less than we are taking out, and the fiscal deficit has grown from £7 billion to £12 billion. Now, sadly, as I pointed out to Mr Swinney earlier, even the SNP website has not yet caught up, still promoting last year's figures. Perhaps the SNP webmaster couldn't bring himself to update them, so depressed was he at the new figures. Now, the SNP response to this is to shift the goalposts. So they say, rather than talk about 1 year's figures in isolation, which of course is what they've been doing non-stop for the past year, they now want to talk about the last 5 years. But why stop there? Why take 5 years? Why not 10 years or 15 years or 30 years or even 100 years? By being so determined, I'll give away in a second, by being so determined to promote 1 year's figures for the last 12 months, they are left no longer with any excuse and are hoisted by their own petard. I'll give way to Mr Allard.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Member, for giving way. Will you accept that the JERS figures are working on a 5-year cycle?
Not a phrase.
Well, if that is the case, why did the SNP spend the last year going around the country promoting 1 year's set of figures as if they were gospel? They can't have it both ways. Now, I want to actually agree with something John Mason has just said, because what actually matters here is not so much what's happened in the past, but what's going to happen in the future. And here we have to take the messages coming out from independent observers. And the CPPR stated, Scotland's fiscal balance is set to worsen. There will be a net fiscal loss under independence looking into the future. Now, the SNP's response is to say we'll do much better from oil revenues than the OBR are predicting, and yet the Scottish Government's own track record in terms of estimating oil revenues is woefully poor, as Mr Brown reminded us. And surely it doesn't make sense to plan our future finances as a nation on the basis of the most optimistic scenarios. For example, I might think I can sell my car for £5,000. But when it comes to it, I might not achieve that price. It would be remarkably foolish of me to go out and spend that £5,000 until I had at least an independent valuation of that figure, not least get a buyer who would be prepared to pay that price or put the money in my bank. And that's what the SNP are trying to do, take the most optimistic set of projections and assume that will be the outturn. No, I need to make some progress. Now, in response to the budget last week, Mr Swinney bemoaned the fact that austerity would be with us for years to come. But the reality is that austerity is with us whether or not we vote for independence. And in fact, under independence, it will get worse. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, already quoted, were quite clear. An independent Scotland would require a significant cut in spending or increase in taxes over and above those already announced by the UK Government in order to put long-term public finances onto a sustainable footing. The scale of this fiscal tightening is likely to be greater than that required for the UK as a whole. And the IFS are not alone, because when we had Professor Jeremy Peat of the David Hume Institute at the Economy Committee 2 weeks ago, a man incidentally who agrees with the SNP's currency position, he said there would need to be greater fiscal tightening in an independent Scotland. And that means either higher taxes or lower public services or a combination of both. Now, the SNP response to this is to say, well, if we were independent, we'd use the economic levers to grow our economy faster than has been the case historically. And yet we would have to go some to beat projected levels of UK growth. As Gavin Brown said, the UK is projected to be the fastest growing Western economy in coming years. And we've yet to hear precisely what measures the SNP would implement in an independent Scotland to exceed even that projected dramatic growth increase for the UK. The SNP might say improvements in childcare will help deliver economic growth. Precisely that point was put by my committee colleague Mike Mackenzie to Paul Johnson of the IFS in the committee 3 weeks ago, to which Paul Johnson said, the evidence on the relationship between universal childcare provision and female labour supply is nothing like as strong as you would expect it to be. So I would not expect an additional X £100 million of spending on childcare to pay for itself in any sense through producing additional tax revenue. That's a clear and substantial statement that the SNP's assumptions around additional childcare are simply wrong and would not be the economic game changer that they would claim. And these are independent voices exposing their approach. Presiding Officer, we know from the projections where the UK economy is growing. It is growing at a record rate. We need to know where the Scottish economy is going in the event that we vote to separate ourselves from the UK. Now, the CPPR have called for an updated version of the Scottish Government of its oil and gas bulletin. They need to go further than that. They need to publish their forward projections. When people in Scotland are coming to vote on independence, they need to know whether our public finances will be better or worse than if we stayed in the UK. At the moment, the SNP are keeping people in the dark, and that's not good enough.
Thanks so much. Now calling Ken McIntosh to be followed by Rob Gibson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. And I was invited to take part in a referendum debate last Friday. I have to say I found the event quite enjoyable. The main reason for that, I believe, is that it was an audience of young people who were clearly very open-minded about the choice before our country rather than particularly partisan or tribal. And I would like to record my thanks, in fact, to not only to those who participated, but to Fixers UK and to the YMCA, who were the sponsors of the event. But what struck me, however, was that more than anything else, the young people there wanted definitive answers. They wanted clarity. They wanted certainty. Certainty, at least, about the facts upon which they could then make up their mind. Now, I sympathise with that view, as I'm sure most voters in Scotland do, but my frustration is not just that there can be no certainty about the case being put forward for an independent Scotland. It's that I worry that the SNP are deliberately pursuing a policy of obfuscation about the facts we should be able to agree upon. As the motion from the Conservatives before us today highlights, I worry that the SNP are deliberately refusing to provide some of the detail that we should be able to agree on. It strikes me that whenever statistics or analysis or research fails to back up the SNP's view of independence, that analysis is either rebutted or ignored. And the reason I believe this is a deliberate policy, a deliberate choice not to provide detail, is that we have a paper from the Cabinet Secretary for Finance in which he revealed a far more accurate analysis of the choices facing an independent Scotland. And this is the point that I think that Willie Rennie made earlier. It is, in fact, an analysis which could have provided a more consensual basis for the rest of us in Scotland to discuss the options before us, an agreed foundation from which we could then have argued the pros and cons for independence. But the Finance Secretary has decided he is only willing to share his real views on Scotland's finances with his Cabinet colleagues. If we just look, for example, at some of the key observations that the Cabinet Secretary for Finance made, but that he wishes to keep secret, Mr Swinney knew in advance that there would be a bigger deficit in Scotland than the UK. And I quote, "In 2016-17, OBR forecasts suggest that Scotland would have a marginally larger net fiscal deficit than the UK. He acknowledged that volatility existed in oil revenue, and I quote again, "There is, however, a high degree of uncertainty around future North Sea revenues, reflecting considerable volatility in production and oil prices." He predicted oil revenue falling. A geographic share of North Sea tax receipts is expected to fall to £4.8 billion in 2016-2017. And as we now know from the GERS figures, it has fallen by 41.5% in 1 year. He recognised the impact on Scotland's public finances of this fall, and I quote again directly, "Given the relative importance of North Sea revenues to Scotland's public finances, these downward revisions have resulted in a deterioration in the outlook for Scotland's public finances. The high level of volatility creates considerable uncertainty in projecting forward Scotland's financial position." And he forecast that public sector finances would be squeezed, and I quote again, "There are also inherent real terms cost pressures within public sector budgets. We will need to be mindful that these pressures could reduce the resources available to provide additional public services." And the point here, Presiding Officer, is that Mr Swinney is not alone. The IFS, the Institute for Fiscal Studies, in a typically dispassionate look at the Scottish finances, highlights almost exactly the same issues. The IFS remind us that public spending per head, so this is something the SNP rarely mention, public spending per head is higher in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. And the IFS go on to say that even based on an optimistic set of assumptions, an independent Scotland would face a more challenging fiscal outlook than the rest of the UK, a challenge that the IFS measure in billions of pounds. The reason that this matters, of course, is that by refusing to give this financial detail, the SNP undermine the credibility of their own case for building a progressive Scotland. As the IFS point out, an independent Scotland would require a significant cut in spending or an increase in taxes to put our finances on a sustainable footing. Yet the only thing we know for sure about the SNP's plans is that they intend to cut taxes, to cut VAT for some tourism industries, to cut air passenger duty, and of course to cut corporation tax for large companies. The First Minister has specifically said that he wouldn't wish Scotland to be put at a competitive tax disadvantage, implying, of course, as the New Statesman put it so well, that his vision is not of a progressive race to the top, but a depressing race to the bottom.
Final minute.
If independence offers us less or no control over our currency, offers us less or no control over our lender of last resort or our interest rates, and with the Cabinet Secretary and the IFS arguing that our fiscal position is likely to be worse, it is no wonder the SNP are deliberately vague about our future. But, Presiding Officer, there is one way of guaranteeing the stability of the Scottish economy so that we can then build the progressive future that many of us want to see, and that is by staying within the UK. Devolution guarantees Scottish influence over interest rates. It guarantees that we will not pursue a destructive race to the bottom on tax. It also guarantees complete control over our health service, over our education, or our housing here in Scotland. Devolution gives us freedom to care for our elderly or to extend childcare. It gives us the best of both worlds. It does not require constitutional change to tackle inequality. It requires political will. It does not require independence to tackle child poverty. It requires political leadership. And I'd hope the Cabinet Secretary will accept that it is difficult to have any confidence in the SNP's plans for our political future if they do not have the confidence to share with us their own financial forecasts for that future.
Thank you very much. I now call Rob Gibson to be followed by Alex Rowley.
Well, thank you, Presiding Officer. You know, the Tory motion today has exposed more about the uncertainties of the UK's economic, social and environmental policies than any of their attempts to talk down Scotland's. I want to question how Scotland needs to be locked into the unstable UK economy, an instability which has been one of the most unbalanced and most unequal in the developed world, one where we're most heavily indebted nations in the world, one of the most unequal in the developed world, one where there's the most regionally unbalanced economies. And these are all issues which have been recognised by the UK's own leaders, such as David Cameron, who described the reliance on London and the South East as fundamentally unstable and wasteful. And yet, you know, John Swinney's amendment repeats the facts that Scotland has generated more tax revenue per person than the UK as a whole in every year since 1980. That's a fact. Meanwhile, the UK's spending plans for the future, another 60% of the cuts still to be implemented, as has been said, to our public spending could put Scotland's economic future at further risk. Of that, there is no doubt. Let me turn to the sources. Excuse me till I make some progress. I may bring you in a minute. Let me turn to the sources of the Tories' arguments. A number of independent experts. They predict weaker fiscal position for the Scottish Government, the IFS in this case. And when you look at the IFS statements in the Finance Committee, the questions about these were, nuanced considerably. David Bell, Professor, says, I think that the IFS report was widely misunderstood in that it was a projection. In other words, it was based on things not changing in policy terms, i.e., that without our own policies, we would stay the same. With our own policies, we could grow our economy. Yeah. So, when you think about the CPPR, which is hardly an independent body, that predicts claims of tighter fiscal challenges by an independent Scottish Government. But Scotland is a wealthy country, 14th in the OECD figures. The UK is 18th. As a leading developer and user of renewable energy and an exporter of renewables and fossil fuels to Britain and Europe and the world, that puts us in a very strong position. So what is interesting is the total lack of CPPR assessment of renewables in the Scottish economy. I have yet to find any analysis that they have made in the CPPR of Scotland's renewables. It's always been oil and nothing else, one part of the economy. Yet, last year, 40% of Scots' electricity supply came from renewables. 100% is achievable as a target by 2020, and it strikes me that the CPPR is a one-string banjo. They do not address the broad Scottish economy. Why not? Why not?
Liz Smith.
On what grounds are you suggesting that the CPPR is not an independent body?
Rob Gibson.
Well, I think we could have a whole debate about the sources of the people who are in it and their political attitude over many years, which are very inimical to the SNP. Meanwhile, the Institute for Fiscal Studies is concerned about the alleged weakness of the fiscal position of an independent Scotland. But we're in the position, where the IFS has got many strings to its bow. Its director, Paul Johnson, is also a member of the UK Climate Change Committee, whose report Reducing Emissions in Scotland 2014 in March was produced yesterday. They praise Scotland's renewable energy output, but reaching 1 gigawatt in the year 2012, and with targets of 1.2 gigawatts per annum till 2020 to meet our targets, but also very much in the case of building up our economy and building it on the energy which we can produce ourselves other than oil. Most of these targets go further than the UK's, and they strengthen Scotland's and the UK's energy security. So why are they being ignored? They'll be hugely adding to Scotland's GDP, and I only need to point to the decisions of Scottish and Southern Energy to back its Beatrice oil field, offshore wind field in the last week, and also recognise that, along with Murray Firth offshore renewables, is far bigger as a project than the Forth replacement crossing. And thankfully, despite the UK energy policy uncertainties, SSE, our biggest company, is on course to develop these major projects, but no thanks to the UK's policies. Indeed, they go further and say that a single energy market in the GB is most likely in the event of a yes vote, and it's their preferred outcome in any case. So we go back to the uncertainties created in the UK situation to do with energy and everything else. The UK government's energy minister has said that there's no way that the UK would buy Scottish renewables. Well, interestingly, he's never said that the UK wouldn't buy Scotland's oil.
You must conclude, please.
He also shuffled away from renewable support to that for nuclear. So the uncertainties fashioned in Westminster are all part of the story which has not been told here in this motion, and therefore the amendment by John Swinney is the one that gets at the truth.
I must ask members to keep to the time. They're taking time out of the final member's speech if they do not. Alex Rowley, to be followed by Jamie Hepburn.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I mean, I would begin by saying that I do not disagree with John Swinney when he talks about the recovery, the slow recovery and growth compared to many other European countries. But I would suggest that the answer to that is not to ditch your comrades, friends and family in England, Wales and Northern Ireland. The answer to that is to ditch the Tories in 2015 and get a Labour government. I would, however, turn to the White Paper and the currency. We now know that the UK government has made clear that, in their view, the currency union will not happen, a position also taken by other political parties in the UK level, where there is agreement that it would not be in the interests of the rest of the UK to accept a currency union with a new state of Scotland. Now, I would have to say that I don't take too kindly to a public schoolboy coming up to Scotland to tell us that we will not be able to use the pound. But the fact is that all the evidence suggests that it would not be in the interests of the UK to enter into a currency union with a new state of Scotland. But more important, I do not believe that it would be in the interests of Scotland to enter into such a currency union with the remainder of the United Kingdom if we had taken the decision to become an independent state. I would suggest that it is the worst of all worlds. Keep the pound, have no say over it, no say over interest rates, money supply, the banks, employment targets or crisis measures. So I would have to say, if you want to keep the pound, then we should stay within the UK with direct representation to Westminster, which makes the laws on the economy, and to have direct representation in government, which supervises and sets the targets for the Bank of England. Economic union, common trading and commercial relationships remain essential. Ironically, even those who want a separate state now favour retaining this economic union with the UK, with shared administration of monetary policy, interest rates, inflation targets, money supply, crisis measures and macroeconomic stability. The difference between the parties is that the SNP wishes UK control without Scottish representation, whereas the Scottish Labour Party wants to ensure that if these matters are under the UK administration, then Scots will have a say in the decisions that are being made. But I also want to focus on what I believe is the unfairness of the SNP government's proposals and the greater inequality that will result for Scotland if we form a separate state as proposed by the SNP. Take one policy, a 3p cut in corporation tax. Scotland's wealthiest companies to the equivalent of £125 a household from the public purse lost to public services and handed to the most profitable companies in the corporate sector. This is just one example of the SNP unfairness versus Labour's fairness. We will not put money into the hands of big business whilst budgets are being cut to schools, to colleges and cut in support and skills to help people get into jobs. No, thank you. The SNP policy would take Scotland on a race to the bottom, and you have to wonder what would be next. But it is not just the handouts to big businesses, for we know that the SNP government will not support Labour's proposals for the transfer of £286 million to hard-pressed families through the energy price freeze. Ironically, it is these same energy companies that will have a double boost under the SNP proposals, for they are also the biggest beneficiaries of the corporation tax handout being proposed as part of the drive to create a separate Scottish state. So I say our economic priorities should be to address the big challenges that are facing our country. 21% of 16 to 24-year-olds are unemployed. College admissions have fallen 36% since 2007. It is not tax handouts to big businesses that the economy needs. It is a national skills strategy and a national jobs strategy. It is the measures to stop low pay. It is having the courage to say that we will insist on a living wage for all public service contracts being issued here in Scotland. It is having the vision to say that we will transform our education system to make sure that no child is left to fail. For I don't believe and cannot accept that any child was born to fail. So in conclusion, Presiding Officer, what is glaringly obvious about the economics of the White Paper is that it will promote inequality, doing very little to address the big issues facing Scotland and Scotland's people as we move forward.
Thank you. I call Jamie Hepburn to be followed by Alex Johnston.
Well, thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I begin by thanking our Tory colleagues for bringing forward the subject for debate? Much has been said over the course of today's debate, and it's impossible to pick up on everything, but I did think it was interesting to hear Malcolm Chisholm setting out that he feels the White Paper is not a model of progressiveness. I would have thought a document that sets out progress towards universal preschool childcare for all children aged 1 to 5, the abolition of the bedroom tax, decency in the state pension, bringing postal services back into public hands, removal of Trident from the Clyde. I would have thought that might be felt by any reasonable person to be a progressive doctrine, even by Malcolm Chisholm, possibly even by Neil Findlay. I suppose it raises the question, what might they reckon? No, I won't just now. Thank you, Mr Rennie. But the question is raised, what might they reckon might be a progressive doctrine? Could it be the findings of Labour's Cuts Commission, which of course is the findings of which have been parked till after the referendum? I wonder why. So I would challenge the Labour Party. Why don't they bring forward those findings before September the 18th, and we can put it to the people of Scotland? What do they consider to be a progressive doctrine? The findings of their Cuts Commission or the Scottish Government's White Paper? I know what my money is on, Presiding Officer. I was also intrigued to hear Gavin Brown, no I won't, Mr Rennie, ask out loud where my colleague Kevin Stewart had been over the recent time. I thought that question could equally be posed of Mr Brown, because he's brought forward a motion for debate today talking about the IFS position on the fiscal challenges facing Scotland. Where was Mr Brown when the Finance Committee held its meeting on the 4th of December,
where we heard the quote from Professor David Bell, when Professor Peter McGregor also asked, we might ask whether the achievement of higher economic growth by a set of policies could get us out of the bind that the IFS has identified. I think the answer to that question is yes. It would be surprising if it were otherwise. Economic growth can help us to get out of that situation. That makes the point. Does it not, Presiding Officer? With the power in Scotland's hands, we can make a positive impact. And my favourite quote from that day, Dr Angus Armstrong, is almost inevitable that the IFS projections will not be correct. I know where I was, Presiding Officer. I was at that Finance Committee meeting. I even know where Mr Brown was. He was at that Finance Committee meeting as well. He obviously just wasn't listening that day. I also thought it was very interesting to hear Jenny Mara laud the CBI. What we didn't hear her mention was the quote from Tony Banks, chairman of Balhousie Care, who said he was a member of the CBI, but the organisation never consulted me on my views on independence, and I don't know of any members they have asked. The CBI leadership is doing what it has always done, President Officer. It's representing its own narrow interests rather than the interests of Scotland, and certainly the interests of their own members' views. And we've got a long-standing record in that regard, because, of course, we can look back to the 1990s when the CBI leadership opposed the creation of the Scottish Parliament in 1997 in the 97 referendum. I would hope all opposition members, even those of those parties who were opposed to it at the time, would recognise that they were wrong, and if they don't, why are they here in the first place? And again, Ms Mara didn't refer to that either. I want to also turn to the issue of oil and gas in particular. And I think in doing that, Presiding Officer, I won't, Mr Brown, thank you. In doing so, I think it's always important to bear in mind that Scotland's productivity levels, without accounting for North Sea oil and gas, are at the same level per capita as the UK as a whole. Oil and gas are a massive bonus for Scotland. They're not the foundation of the Scottish economy. And the first point I wanted to make was where Ian Gray talked of Shell and BP's proposition that they are concerned about operating in a stable environment. Presiding Officer, I might take that proposition somewhat more seriously. If these self-same companies weren't operating in some of the most hostile, unstable environments across this globe, areas where they face threats of terrorism and civil war, the idea that these companies wouldn't want to operate in an independent Scotland is an absolute nonsense, and I think we would do well to bear that in mind. But let's look at the situation now in the North Sea. Oil and Gas UK estimate that capital investment in 2013 reached £14.4 billion, which is more than doubled since 2010. And of course, in relation to the financial year, which members are talking about just now, that's important because that reduced revenues by £2 billion. Paul Johnson, the Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, appeared at the Finance Committee earlier this month, and he explained that this investment is one of the reasons why revenue has been lower. That investment can be offset against tax payments. And again, of course, this will be more information that was lost on Mr Brown. But of course, that no, not just now, Mr Brown. And that investment has been concentrated in the Scottish share of the North Sea. Oil and Gas UK forecast that production will increase from 1.4 million barrels a day to 1.7 million barrels by 2017. That's why an independent Scotland, of course, would support such investment as it benefits, as we would benefit by it in the long run. And in terms of the oil and gas price, members are clinging to the OBR estimates on oil price, but what they are failing to recognise is, while they assume an oil price of $99 per barrel, DEC have put estimates at $120. So I would pose the question to Tory members, how do they square that circle? How do they respond to the difference between their own government department and the OBR? And of course, we should reflect on the fact that the Scottish Government has been more cautious than DEC itself on the oil price. So it's more cautious than the UK Government position. President, I want to bring it back to first principles in closing. I think all of us surely accept, and we heard that from Mr Chisholm, that Scotland has what it takes to be an independent country. We have the economic base.
You must
without
close, please.
That independence, I fear that we're in a downward spiral as part of the UK Government. The UK Government we didn't elect slashing our budget and harming families. We saw that with the recent budget. We have the foundations to be a successful independent country. We have to embrace that opportunity.
Thank you very much. Alec Johnson, to be followed by Mike Mackenzie.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I begin by saying I've heard some things today I won't forget in a while. And the first one I heard actually happened before this debate started, when myself and one or two others were held prisoner by the BBC through in the garden lobby to do a brief interview. And during that, I heard a wonderful claim by Kenny Gibson. He told us very straightforwardly that Scotland runs an £8.8 billion surplus. You can check the BBC iPlayer, that's what he said. Of course, some of us knew what he actually meant. What he meant was that if you take the last 5 years' figures and you make the comparison between the expenditure in Scotland and that for the UK as a whole, you can separate out £8.8 billion that were saved in Scotland relative to that budget. It wasn't a surplus at all, it was a reduced deficit, and it was 5 years. So if you say it very quickly, it sounds very effective. The trouble is, Kenny Gibson and one or two others on the SNP backbenches are guilty of that cardinal sin, and that is believing their own propaganda. Now, there is one person who I don't believe that will make that mistake, and that's John Swinney. Because John Swinney, I've said many times in debate, is my favourite government minister. He is the man who knows how things work. He is the man with the brains. He is the man, after all, who came forward with the famous secret report to Cabinet that contained within it all the predictions we now know to be absolutely 100% accurate. He is also the man who I've expressed my admiration for on a number of occasions, the man who has implemented the policy of austerity here in Scotland in an adept and professional way that I think we should be all proud of. The problem is that he then qualifies that by saying, if of course this was an independent Scotland, he would spend money like it was going out of fashion and he'd ruin all the good work he'd previously done. In his opening speech, he of course made reference to Scotland's fiscal position. And he got into that position once again where he was talking about revenue from oil. And he tells us, of course, the reason why the figures have gone from a relatively healthy deficit of £7 billion a year to the unhealthy position of a £12 billion a year deficit in the last year's figures. He tells us the reason for that is the amount of tax relief that was claimed against investment. And of course, that's true. There was a lot of investment, there was a lot of tax relief. Where he goes wrong, and the First Minister joins him regularly in this, is assuming that this is some kind of one-off cost. The truth is that we require continuous investment in the North Sea, if anything else, simply to slow the rate of decline of the industry, let alone actually increase production. Worse still, both are very keen on the idea of completely forgetting about the importance of decommissioning to the future of the industry and the fact that that cost too can be set against tax. So the danger is that as production continues in the North Sea and money continues to roll in, that companies will have plenty of opportunity to set costs against tax and keep that total revenue down. There's one or two other things I've heard, and I have to go on to people like Christian Allard, who spoke out very strongly about the strengths of the North East economy. Yes, it's wonderful to have an economy where our local authorities and our health service struggle to recruit against a private sector who is aggressively recruiting their staff. And we also see organisations like the police force struggling to maintain numbers as the private sector suck people out of these industries. Yes, I would like to see the whole of Scotland have to face up to that problem, but unfortunately the whole of Scotland will not take the choices that have been made in the North East. In fact, what I heard from Christian Allard was almost the I'm all right Jack approach, and he should be careful. He could get Aberdonians a bad reputation coming up with things like that. The truth is, you couldn't make it up. And what we get from the backbenches of the SNP is a simple chant, yes we can. Unfortunately, there are one or two others I need to address during the course of this debate. Now, Chick Brodie, I think, gave away a secret when he attacked Neil Findlay, suggesting that his brains had somehow gone to his head. Well, can I say to Chick Brodie, if his brains were in his head, perhaps he would not be sitting over there, and he might still be sitting over here with the Liberal Democrats. I must come to a close because I have only 1 minute left. Because the main issue I want to come to before I close is the issue of welfare. This government and many speakers during the course of this debate today have talked about what this government would like to do in an independent Scotland to the welfare budget. Nicola Sturgeon has historically mentioned figures, never mentioning how many years they applied to. She has variously asked for £1.5 billion, £2.5 billion and £4.5 billion of additional expenditure. Every week on the Welfare Reform Committee, we hear SNP members hinting that in an independent Scotland, welfare would be generously provided for. And in debate after debate, we hear that hint made in this chamber. However, if there is to be any credibility in that, we must hear the Finance Minister tell us how that will be funded, because as of today, there has been no indication of how much extra expenditure they would put into welfare and how that money would be raised. Please. And with the budget we have in front of us so far, it's obvious that it either comes through reduced expenditure or increased taxation. Tell us now before we vote.
Mike Mackenzie, I'm sorry, I can only give you 5 minutes.
Presiding Officer, I must say at the outset that I'm disappointed at the relish the opposition parties take in any opportunity to talk down Scotland's prospects and talk down Scotland. And I'm actually concerned for their well-being, because it must be truly depressing and debilitating to live under the cloud of doom and gloom that they constantly manufacture. But I would like to cheer them up, and I would firstly draw their attention to the fact that even without oil and gas, GDP per capita in Scotland is 99% of the UK average. Even without oil and gas, we're a wealthy country. Even without oil and gas, Standard & Poor's say that Scotland would be successful. And of course, oil and gas is a very welcome bonus. And the only depressing, no thank you, I'm short of time, and the only depressing aspect of this good fortune is that successive UK governments failed to set up an oil fund. And in trying to talk down Scotland's oil, the Unionists are singing a sad old song, a lament, a dirge, with a déjà vu quality about it, because we've heard all this before. We heard all this in the 70s, when we were told that Scotland's oil was the wrong type of oil, when we were told that there wasn't much oil, when we were told that it would run out in 30 years or less. But it was only with the uncovering of the 1974 Macron report in 2005, secretly buried under the 30-year rule, that we finally had proof of what we all knew was the truth. No thank you, I'm out short of time. And both Tory and Labour governments knew back then in the 1970s the full and the immense value of Scotland's oil, and they knew that it had the potential to propel an independent Scotland into a period of unparalleled prosperity. They were disingenuous then, Presiding Officer, and they're disingenuous now. And while they told us this, they quietly siphoned off over £300 billion of revenue from Scotland's oil, leaving no legacy and no lasting benefit. Presiding Officer, it is of course correct that oil and gas revenues have declined in the last year, and it's worth examining why. Firstly, as Christian Allard mentioned, the Elgin field was unfortunately shut down for almost a year. Secondly, there have been capital allowances, no thank you, in respect of record investments, amounting to an estimated £2 billion. But perhaps more importantly is the long-term fiscal instability outlined in the Wood Report, with no less than 16 significant fiscal changes in the last decade. What industry can prosper under such uncertainty? And Sir Ian Wood says that they failed to provide an appropriate regulatory framework. He says that DEC have failed to allocate sufficient resources to properly understand the sector. He says that DEC have failed to talk to their colleagues in the Treasury to make sure that the fiscal and regulatory regimes are complementary. It's little wonder then, Presiding Officer, that recovery rates in the UK continental shelf fields are only 40%, whilst those in Norway's fields are 48%. And it's worth noting too that it's only when George Osborne U-turned on his 2011 tax raid that we have seen investment return to the sector, with a record investment of £14.4 billion in the last year. But it's truly stretching the imagination to suggest that these investors don't know what they're doing.
Final minute.
That this highly sophisticated industry doesn't know what it's doing. That UK oil and gas estimates that there are 24 billion barrels of oil are incorrect. And it is simply not credible to suggest that the industry are making these investments on the back of long-term oil price forecasts which don't suggest strong and stable prices. Presiding Officer, production is set to increase from 1.4 million barrels a day to 1.7 million barrels in 2017. When even DEC disagree with the OBR forecast and assume an oil price of $120 a barrel compared to OBRs of $99, it's clear that the industry is set for a more prosperous future than the OBR predict. With independence, we can nurture this golden goose instead of strangling it. With the powers to set a stable and consistent regulatory and fiscal regime, and with increasingly clever technology, production rates will rise. And Scotland can be assured of the full economic benefit of our oil and gas.
Many thanks. I now turn to the closing speeches and to call on Ian Gray. Up to 6 minutes, please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. It's 5 or 6 months now since the IFS demolished the economic case contained in the White Paper and demonstrated that an independent Scotland would face a worse fiscal position than the UK as a whole, and that would require then tax rises, spending cuts or both, just to stand still. Since then, as many members have referred to, we've seen actual oil revenues fall by almost 45% in 1 year. Predictions have fallen further. And we've also seen a series of commentators, such as the SRC, CPPR, BlackRock Investments, and indeed the CBI today, come to the same conclusions as the IFS did. Since then, the OBR have revisited their own predictions twice. Yet, as Gavin Brown pointed out, the Scottish Government are still working on a year-old estimate of oil revenues, which looked wildly over-optimistic at the time, and is now close to suggesting 2013-14 outturn figures at twice the OBR. Well, I'll take one bit briefly.
Mike McKenzie.
Mr Gray, thank you very much. And I know you take a very keen interest in these things and are quite expert in oil and gas. Can you therefore explain to me why the OBR have changed their methodology and have now taken some of what was offshore revenue and transferred that to be onshore? Could you explain that, please?
Well, the way in which we estimate revenues offshore and onshore, I think it's something which is reviewed all the time. But I do want to say something about that with regard to the IFS in just a moment. There's been much criticism, of course, of the OBR, and
Order, please.
one has to agree that the OBR don't always get their estimates right. In fact, in recent times, they've been far too optimistic, just not as optimistic as the Scottish Government. So Gavin Brown, I think, is absolutely right to demand an update. Mr Swinney's criticism of all of this commentary, of course, was that it's all the same thing because it's all based on the OBR. But that is not true. The IFS, as he well knows, looked at a number of scenarios, and in the most optimistic scenario, they used the Scottish Government's own oil figures, the Scottish Government's own optimistic projections for immigration, for debt share, for interest rates, and indeed assumed, Mr Mackenzie, that as offshore activity reduced, it would be replaced by onshore activity instead. And it still came to the conclusion that an independent Scotland would face tax rises or cuts or both in order to simply stand still. But the truth is, we've heard all sorts of figures bandied about today, and no doubt the less comprehensible they are, the happier the Scottish Government will be. There have been many attempts to convince us either how wealthy we are as part of the United Kingdom, and we've acknowledged that we are, or indeed how bad the UK position actually is. But all of these have really missed the point, because all the commentators tell us that it is a relative position which will be worse should we choose separation. And Mr Rowley hit the nail on the head when he said the way to deal with our shared dislike of coalition policies is to get rid of the coalition government. But there are two readily time doesn't allow. But there are two readily comprehensible illustrations of what all this means, and they have not been addressed today. If the Cabinet Secretary were the Chancellor of an independent Scotland, the simple fact is that he would this year have faced a £4.5 billion shortfall in his budget, equivalent to all of the school's budget. Now, he has suggested, as many of his colleagues have done, that this is but a blip caused by extra investment and by problems in production in the Elgin field. But, Presiding Officer, that just proves exactly the point, that oil revenue is massively volatile, and that would be a huge risk for a separate Scotland. And as for this argument that this is a blip because of significant investment in the year that we're talking about, which is set against tax, surely the core point that Ian Wood made in his report was that in order to extract the remaining resources from the North Sea, that investment would have to continue. And what that means, of course, is that we will continue to see a fall in the revenues, the profits, and therefore the tax which flows to government as North Sea oil is recovered. Secondly, CPPR this week have demonstrated that at the point of independence, Scotland would be worse off than the UK to the tune of £1,000 for every man, woman and child. That's £1,000 more tax, less public services or higher borrowing. Mr Rennie was right when he said that Mr Swinney once had a reputation for managing the finances, and that John Swinney told his Cabinet colleagues the unvarnished truth, that an independent Scotland would be at the mercy of volatile falling oil receipts, unable to guarantee pensions and having to slash public spending. He was right. The figures say he was right. The commentators say he was right. It is only the Scottish Government who refused to accept that reality. And the losers in all of this are the people of Scotland. Their choice it is in September, and they want facts on which to base that choice. Instead, they are being given assertions which fly in the face of all the evidence. Mr Stewart talked about a can-do attitude. Well, the least the Scottish Government can do is to start telling the public the truth about the economics of independence.
Thank you. And I call on John Swinney, Cabinet Secretary, up to 8 minutes, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I never thought, Presiding Officer, that I would come to a debate and end up feeling sorry for Neil Findlay, but it's happened to me this afternoon. His heart must have really sank when Jenny Mara opened her contribution as the official spokesperson of the Labour Party in this debate and said, "Only this morning the CBI warned." That must have really been a body blow to Mr Findlay, given the crusading speech we got from him about how the Labour Party was ploughing this great socialist agenda to try to reform the country. It is nothing of the sort from anything I've heard about. And for Mr Rowley, who knows he comes to this Parliament with enormous respect from me, I wonder if Mr Rowley was aware of who was cutting corporation tax in 1998. I wonder who was cutting corporation tax in 1998, and I wonder who was also cutting corporation tax in 2008, when it fell from 31% to 30% and 30% to 28%. And of course, it was, the cuts, I'll give way in a moment, of course, the cuts in corporation tax in 1998 and 2008 were being taken forward by Labour Chancellors of the Exchequer. So there, I have confirmed to Parliament that revelation that the Labour Party was in fact cutting corporation tax. Of course, I'll give way.
Ian Gray.
This, of course, is a point that Mr Swinney often makes. Will he acknowledge equally that those cuts in corporation took place at a time when Gordon Brown and the Labour government were increasing spending on health and education and welfare to a degree that had never been seen before in this country?
John Swinney.
Well, I think if we add all that together, all those assumptions about revenue and expenditure, and look at the fact that the country went bust I think that tells us all we need to know about Gordon Brown. Because what Gordon Brown was also telling us, I sat in the House of Commons and I listened to Gordon Brown telling us about all the financial management he was going to do, how everything was going to be sorted out, how he personally had abolished boom and bust. And of course we all know, as Mr Johnson has of course reminded us on countless occasions, that was complete rubbish. Of course I'll give way to Mr
Alex Shiley.
Would the Cabinet Secretary accept that the difference was that in cutting corporation tax across the UK, you're not going to end up setting region against region, competing with each other in a drive to the bottom? And that's the problem, we're only cutting it in Scotland.
Cabinet Secretary.
I just come from the very straightforward point of view that I want to do what's right to improve the performance of the Scottish economy and to strengthen the opportunities for the people that live here and to seek those opportunities. Now, a large part of the debate has hinged around the quality of estimates that can be made around the public finances. And I just want to share with Parliament some observations about the quality of OBR analysis that has been undertaken. In March 2013, the OBR forecast that economic growth in the United Kingdom economy in 2013 would be 0.6%. 0.6%. 12 months later, they came back and reforecast that. They set out their analysis, and it was 1.8%, 3 times higher than the OBR analysis. In March 2013, the OBR forecast growth in the UK economy to be 1.8% in 2014, and in fact they have now, as Mr Brown has fairly said, set out that estimate as 2.7%, 50% higher in the space of 12 months. Now, the Chancellor, when he went to the House of Commons last Wednesday, trumpeted this as the biggest upward revision to growth between budgets for at least 30 years. Now, anybody who can look at the information I've just put on the record and suggest that the OBR is in possession of some holy grail of forecasting, it's more like Monty Python in the terms of the forecasting that the OBR is able to undertake. Talking of Monty Python, of course.
Thank you, Ms Finney, for giving way. Just on the subject of over-optimistic forecasts, we saw the CPPR paper on Monday that said the Scottish Government's forecasts for North Sea oil revenues were skewed in an optimistic manner. Surely he should listen to them, or does he share Mr Gibson's view that they are not an independent source of information?
I think what we've got to do, be careful about forecasting, is the analysis that's presented and goes with some of this material. And let me just, now I'm just going to go through that. Professor Bell, David Bell, went to the Finance Committee on the 4th of December, and there's a bit of a debate as to whether Mr Brown was listening or not that day, but he appears to have been present. Professor Bell said, "I think the IFS report was widely misunderstood in that it was a projection, the suggestion it was a projection." Professor Bell says, in other words, it was based on things not changing in policy terms. Now, what the IFS did was essentially set out the economic conditions that would prevail in Scotland if we remained part of the United Kingdom, on the basis that GERS does not predict the economics of an independent Scotland. It simply rolls forward the public finances as they are today. Now, at the same session, Professor Peter McGregor said this: "We might," and this is the material point, this is the fundamental point about the debate, about whether we just resign ourselves to economic difficulties and perpetual austerity, or whether we take the powers to do something about it. Professor Peter McGregor said, "We might ask ourselves whether the achievement of higher economic growth by a set of policies that could get us out of the bind that the IFS has identified. I think the answer to that question is yes. It would be surprising if it were otherwise. Economic growth can help us to get out of the situation." And that is, for me, Presiding Officer, the absolutely core point in this debate. Are we prepared to assume the responsibilities? Yes, why not?
Gavin Brown.
It's a bad day, Presiding Officer, when the Cabinet Secretary uses Jamie Hepburn as his wingman on economic issues. But let me ask him this. He has just said that economic growth this year will be 2.7%. What level of economic growth would be needed in Scotland to avoid fiscal tightening?
Cabinet Secretary, and you're approaching your last minute.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. The point I'm making to Mr Brown and to his colleagues is that we have been subjected to a prolonged and unnecessary period of economic austerity as a consequence of the mistakes that have been made by the UK Government and how they have pursued economic strategy. And if we take the economic levers to ourselves, we can use the resources of Scotland, the capabilities, the strengths in key industries in Scotland to generate a stronger economic performance in Scotland. And frankly, we could not deliver a performance that could be any worse to the performance delivered by the United Kingdom in the shocking failure to reach economic estimates that they made themselves in 2010. What this debate is about is whether, as Mr Mackenzie quite rightly said, we are going to resign ourselves to listening to a perpetual unionist dirge in the years to come, or whether we decide to take the responsibilities for ourselves, build a future for our country and ensure that the people of this country can realise the economic opportunities to which they are absolutely entitled and which the wealth and the creativity of the Scottish population gives us every right to be confident that we can deliver.
Thank you, Cabinet Secretary. I now call on Gavin Brown to wind up the debate at 10 minutes. Please, Mr Brown.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Well, I think the Cabinet Secretary's blatant inability to answer that last question really proves the point that our party has been trying to make. He stood up and pointed out, as the Chancellor did, about record improvements in growth forecasts, as high as 2.7% for this year, and better growth for next year, the year after, and the year after that. And my simple question was this: given that the high growth that is projected for the UK going forward, what level of economic growth would be required to avoid any fiscal tightening whatsoever? Because that's the position of the Scottish Government. They don't want to put forward the fiscal tightening that the UK Government wants to do, and they ignore the fact that independent expert commentators suggest they would have to go further than the UK level of fiscal tightening in order to get the public finances in a sustainable place. The IFS said this, Deputy Presiding Officer: even under the most optimistic scenario, in which Scotland experiences high migration, 2.2% productivity growth, debt share of 40% Scottish national income, pays the same interest rate on debt as the UK, and has high North Sea revenues, we still estimate that the fiscal gap for Scotland would be 1.9% of national income, i.e. significantly larger than the gap that we estimate the UK faces of 0.8%. So the independent experts are saying they would have to go further than the rest of the UK, but the Scottish, in just a second, but the Scottish Government are saying they won't even take the measures from the UK Government. How on earth can they square the circle? I'll give way to Mr Brodie.
Very much. It reminds me of the quote that you cannot make a crab walk straight. Today, from a source, we heard about quantitative easing, which the UK Government has been buying back its own debt. And the Government has asked the Bank of England to return the interest on bought gilts, a sum of about £4 billion. Now, we've talked about openness today. Scotland has not had a share of that. Will you support a request to the Chancellor that he returns something that will be equivalent to 0.8% of our GDP?
Gavin Brown.
Mr Brodie is a unique character, Deputy Presiding Officer. He's managed to unite the chamber in confusing me, all of my benches, all of his pensions, and indeed the Labour pensions with that contribution, or that peroration, as he likes to call it. But I have to say, Mr Brodie said earlier, the opposition have a cheek to ask for more than a single year's figures from the Scottish Government. So he must have been...
Brodie.
The opposition have a cheek to ask for more than a single year's figures. So he must have been very disappointed when John Swinney said earlier he was going to provide several years' worth of figures, just as the opposition had requested. But let me just pick up on a couple of other points from this debate before addressing Mr Swinney's commitment that he made earlier. Some of the comments from the Scottish Government. Well, the first one was this: we heard from the Scottish Government that we were the 8th richest country in the OECD, but all of a sudden, a few months later, we were only the 14th richest country in the OECD. Now, they laugh as if the error was made by this party as opposed to this party over here. But the excuse we were given, in just a second, the excuse we were given is that it's because of the methodology. The reason we've dropped is because of the methodology. And so the question is this: were we ever then, in terms of the White Paper, the 8th richest, or was that yet another error in the White Paper?
Cabinet Secretary.
The figure of the 8th richest nation in the OECD was based on the methodology of the OECD at that time. The methodology has changed. What we are all guffawing about is Mr Brown bemoaning the fact that we're only the 14th richest nation in the world. Why does he always talk down Scotland in this terrible fashion?
Gavin Brown.
What a woeful answer, Presiding Officer, that was indeed. The methodology changed and suddenly we've dropped 6 places. The clue, of course, was in the Scottish Government figures before, when it said right at the very bottom, source, Scottish Government calculations. But let's pick up on something else Mr Swinney said, because it's been oft repeated, because they don't like the most recent edition of GERS, so they're determined to go to the 5-year programme of GERS. And they have said, without a hint of embarrassment, that if we'd been independent 5 years ago, we would be £1,600 per head better off. Now that gets a big cheer. So let's just work backwards to 2008, Presiding Officer, to when those figures came from. Let's imagine we had gone independent on the 24th of March 2008, just as they would have wanted to do. Well, the policy of the Scottish Government at that time, of course, was to join the euro. Right? So we would have joined the euro in 2008. 5 months after becoming independent, the 2 largest banks in the country collapsed and needed a bailout, and then 2 years later, the euro goes into meltdown. I don't think anyone on the planet can believe that if we had gone independent in 2008, we would be £1,600 better off per person in the country. But let's welcome the commitment made by John Swinney today in the latter part of his speech. He spent 90% of his speech avoiding Scotland's fiscal position in 2016-17, avoiding any future projections and avoiding the fact that almost all of his policy commitments are uncosted and that he has said nothing about transitional costs in the White Paper. But let's put that to one side for a moment and welcome the commitments that were made. Because he said that in the coming weeks he is going to publish an oil and gas analytical bulletin. So let's welcome that. We look forward to seeing the updates in the figures. Now, he described it as the 3rd bulletin. Now, that's technically correct, but I should point out that the 2nd bulletin, a cameo appearance from the First Minister when it comes down to discussing Scotland's finances, should we become independent. But in the 2nd bulletin, there was not a hint, not even a mention, not even a clue about the oil and gas revenues expected over the next 5 or 6 years. So it may well have been called the 2nd bulletin, but it avoided in its entirety all figures on revenues. And so we hope that the 3rd edition will actually have the figures that we request, and not just a little survey which the last one had. We welcome too the fact that he's saying he's going to put forward projections for the years post-16-17. Now, there was a rumour circulating that the Cabinet Secretary wanted to do this in the White Paper, that he was blocked from doing so. He felt there ought to be greater figures in there. Now, that has touched a nerve, Presiding Officer. This has touched a nerve quite clearly, but we're glad that he has now decided to do so. But when he does...
Excuse me, Mr Brown. The front bench is getting a bit excitable. Mr Brown.
They are struggling today, Presiding Officer. It's just a pity we didn't have most of the front bench here when we're discussing the future of Scotland's finances should we become independent. But when he does publish it, will he put in the policy costings of the promises that he and his government have made? such as the pensions paper that was produced with 30 policies in it, 30 commitments, but only one of them costed? Will they put in all the costings for that? Or their stabilisation fund? They say that they will immediately, following independence, establish a stabilisation fund. Will they put in the costings for that, for setting it up, and how much they intend to put into it in year one, when we are projected to be running a 5.5% of GDP deficit? Will they put in the policy costings of renationalising the Royal Mail, a policy announced in this chamber by the First Minister, much to the surprise of the Cabinet Secretary, his own party and the rest of the country? Will they put in their policy costings for welfare? Because they complain about the welfare position within the UK, but they have made no commitment to reverse most of the measures taken. One or two they have done, but most of them they haven't. When they publish this, it's critical that we get the actual policy costings and we get the transition costs, because otherwise the piece of paper will not be worth anything in terms of furthering the debate. We've asked for oil costings, we've asked for an updated fiscal position, we've asked for papers beyond 16-17. It's critical that we get it, and that's why we brought forward this debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Brown. That concludes the debate on Scotland's finances. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 9467 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a business programme. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 9467.
Move, Presiding Officer.
No members asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 9467 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of Business Motion 9468 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau setting out a Stage 1 timetable for the Historic Environment Scotland Bill. Any member who wishes to speak against the motion should press the request to speak button now, and I call on Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 9468.
Moved.
No members asked to speak against the motion, therefore I now put the question to the Chamber. The question is that motion number 9468 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. The next item of business is consideration of 5 parliamentary bureaus. I'd ask Joe Fitzpatrick to move motion number 9481 on the suspension of standing orders.
Presiding Officer, in moving this motion, I think it's worth clarifying to the Chamber that business managers have agreed to this proposal in recognition of the exceptional circumstances on this occasion, and to be clear that this does not set a precedence for future occasions, and as such I move the motion on behalf of the Parliamentary Bureau.
Thank you. Motion numbers 9469 and 9471 to 9473 on approval of SSIs on block.
On block.
The question on these motions will be put decision time, to which we now come. There are 4 questions to be put as a result of today's business. The first question is that the first question is that amendment number 9462.2 in the name of John Swinney, which seeks to amend motion number 9462 in the name of Gavin Brown on Scotland's finances, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The Parliament is not agreed. We move to vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 9462.2 in the name of John Swinney is as follows. Yes, 65. No, 54. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed to. Sorry, the amendment is therefore agreed to. Sorry, Mr Brown. Can I just read it out again? The result of the amendment number 9462.2 in the name of John Swinney is as follows. Yes, 65. No, 54. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 9462, in the name of Gavin Brown, as amended, on Scotland's finances, be agreed to. Are we all agreed? Yes. The Parliament is not agreed. We move to vote. Members should cast their votes now. The result of the vote on motion number 9462 in the name of Gavin Brown as amended is as follows. Yes 63, no 55. There were no abstentions, so the motion as amended is therefore agreed to. The next question is that motion number 9481 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on a suspension of standing orders be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motion is therefore agreed to. I propose to ask a single question on motion numbers 9469 and 9471 to 9473 on approval of SSIs. If any member objects to a single question being put, please say so now. The next question then is that motions number 9469 and 9471 to 9473 in the name of Joe Fitzpatrick on approval of SSIs be agreed to. Are we all agreed? The motions are therefore agreed to. That concludes decision time. We now move to members' business. Members who leave the chamber should now do so quickly and quietly.